It was late August 2016 when something strange happened in Sylvan, a small town in Australia with about 1,300 people. Just 30 miles east of Melbourne, this quiet farming town was home to the Tromp family, a well-respected and successful household. Mark Tromp, 51, and his wife, Jacoba, 53, owned a red currant farm and an earth-moving business. They worked hard running their businesses with the help of their 3 adult children, Rihanna, 29, Mitchell, 25, and Ella, 22. The family lived on the farm, and every day they worked together to keep things running. But on August 29, 2016, something went terribly wrong. Without warning, the entire Tromp family just vanished. They left their home in a hurry, abandoning everything: phones, wallets, credit cards, and even their identification. It was as if they fled in a panic. But why? What could have made a normal, hardworking family suddenly disappear without a trace? Today, we will talk about the mystery of the Tromp family, one of the strangest disappearances in Australian history. Their absence wasn't noticed actually right away. It wasn't until the next day, August 30th, that someone called the police reporting that Mark and Jacoba were missing. When officers arrived at the Tromp home, they found something that was fairly unsettling. The house was in absolute chaos, as if someone had been searching for something desperately. But there was no sign of struggle. Even more bizarre, every car in the driveway had its keys in the ignition, ready to go, except for Ella's car, which was missing. The front and back doors of the house were left unlocked, and no one could understand what had happened. Authorities believe that the Tromp family hadn't just gone on a spontaneous trip. Instead, it seemed like they had fled in a state of pure panic. But what had frightened them so badly that they would just leave everything behind? Making things even more confusing, the family didn't take their bank cards, their phones, or identification with them as previously mentioned, and this made it almost impossible for the police to track them. Investigators searched the house and found most of the family's phones were still there except for one. Mitchell's phone was missing. Nothing about the scene made any sense. The Tromps were known for their peaceful, kind of predictable life. They worked hard on their farm and rarely caused trouble. The farm wasn't just their business, it was something that they absolutely loved. But behind the scenes, something strange had been happening, and it was kind of, a known and not an unknown. For months prior to any disappearance, Mark Tromp had been acting a bit differently. He had become anxious, withdrawn, and deeply paranoid. He believed that someone or something was watching them. He didn't know who or why, but he was convinced that his family was in danger. Now, this could be kind of excused as maybe, Mark was just having a mental break, or maybe something else was going on, like he didn't have his coffee that morning. But the problem was, over time, his wife Jacoba started feeling the same way. Outwardly, nothing seemed wrong. The Tromp family appeared to be living their normal, hardworking life, but inside the home, fear was beginning to take hold. Rihanna, Mitchell, and Ella knew something was off. Their parents, Mark and Jacoba, were convinced that they were in terrible danger. Their adult children tried to reassure them, telling them that everything was okay, but no matter what they said, Mark and Jacoba wouldn't listen. Then, on August 29th, everything reached a breaking point. That day, Mark told his family that they had no time left. He believed that they were in grave danger and needed to leave immediately. Both he and Jacoba insisted that they had to act fast before it was too late. For Rihanna, Mitchell, and Ella, the idea of suddenly abandoning their home and farm made zero sense, as it would for pretty much everybody. It was confusing, it was terrifying, but Mark's fears were so intense, so unshakable, that it had made them second-guess everything that they had thought. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. Was there something out there? Was it somebody coming for them? They didn't know, but looking at the fear that he had, they knew that at least something had to be wrong. At first, Mark's plan was to fly overseas, but just before they could head to the airport, he had changed his mind. He feared that using their passports would allow their enemies, whoever those were, to track them. Instead, they needed to go off the grid. So, in a state of panic, the family piled into Ella's SUV, left everything behind, and fled their home. As they drove, Mark noticed that Mitchell still had his phone with him. To Mark, this was dangerous. He believed the phone was essentially a tracking device that could lead their enemies straight to them. So about 22 miles into the trip, he forced Mitchell to throw it out the window. But unlike his parents, Mitchell wasn't convinced that they were in real danger. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. Somebody had completely lost it. Well, something was seriously wrong with this family, and his father had completely lost it. They drove for hours. Their destination was actually Bathurst, a town in New South Wales, over 385 miles away. That meant they had been driving non-stop, barely resting, fueled only by their fear. By the time they arrived, Mitchell had had enough. He couldn't take it anymore, so right there in Bathurst, he told his family he was leaving, and then he stepped out of the car and walked away. Mitchell was frustrated. He had watched his family spiral into paranoia, and now he was stranded. No phone, no money, and no way to get home. Meanwhile, the rest of the Tromp family kept going. They avoided the bigger towns, sticking to the quiet countryside roads as if they were trying to stay hidden. Their journey led them to a strange and unexpected place, the Jenolan Caves, deep in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales. No one knows exactly why they chose the caves. Was it a random stop, or did they already know about them? Whatever the reason, it was a bit of a strange decision. The caves were remote, surrounded by dense wilderness, and there were no supplies, no shelter except for the cave itself, I guess, and no real way to survive there for all that long. It seemed like a fairly terrible place to hide. Yet the Jenolan Caves are no ordinary caves. They are some of the oldest known cave systems in the world, holding deep cultural significance to the indigenous Australian people who, for centuries, have mysterious stories that surround them. And here's where things kind of get a bit mysterious. According to some reports in Aboriginal folklore, the caves were believed to call people, sometimes for protection, and other times for something far more unsettling. The Aboriginal stories surrounding the Jenolan Caves are both kind of fascinating and chilling if you ever look into them, but according to legend, some people are called to them, drawn by what is said to be an unseen force. Those who receive visions of the caves are told to go immediately there. These visions are believed to be a warning, but a warning of what? Even more unsettling, elders of the Burra Burra people sometimes felt the caves beckoning to them. They claimed that if they journeyed deep enough, they would gain visions or even possibly some unknown knowledge. But not all of the stories surrounding these caves are, rainbows and unicorn farts. There are whispers of strange voices heard within these caves, not just by indigenous people, but by modern-day tourists who have traveled there as well. Some have reported feeling watched, while others say they have heard whispering voices echoing through the caverns, and they know nobody was in there. Of course, it could just be a bunch of teenagers who snuck in to, drink beer or smoke or something, so you never really know what's kind of going down in caverns. But then, one of the things that's said is to be out there are lights. Deep within the caves, glowing floating orbs have been seen. Drifting through the darkness, the indigenous people believe that these are trickster spirits of some sort, leading people deeper and deeper until they became hopelessly lost. And the warnings are clear. Enter the caves with respect or risk vanishing forever. Some would say that these stories were really just meant to scare children away from dangerous caves, which, to be honest with you, is a fair assessment. Most folklore, I don't know why I said folklore like that, folklore, whatever. Most of that is really just to kind of scare people away from going to a dangerous area or teaching kids to stay out of the forest or not Hansel and Gretel, not just trust random adults even if they look older because they could be a witch, things like that. So that's a fair assessment, but others do insist that those who enter with arrogance or bad intentions, which because of what I just said would be considered arrogance, may be claimed by the spirits, never to be seen again, which means I would be claimed by the spirits, never to be seen again. That sucks. But it's impossible to say what truly lies within the Jenolan Caves, but one fact remains. The Tromp family, who believed that they were in danger, fled to these caves of all places. And stories like these exist all over the world. Tales of caves that call to people, of mysterious voices and strange lights, of places that seem to lure the lost and the desperate. In fact, I believe in the Appalachian Mountains, I forget which mountain it is specifically, but there are lights that can be seen on it all the time, yet nobody's supposed to be up there, really there is nobody up there. So it's been happening for hundreds of years. So when the Tromp family arrived at the Jenolan Caves, something changed. No one knows what triggered it, but suddenly Ella and Rihanna were also terrified. Their parents' behavior had already been strange, but now, in the silence of these caves, it felt wrong. So wrong that the two sisters made a split-second decision to just GTFO. They abandoned their parents and ran. Somehow, they found an unlocked car nearby. Maybe the keys were left inside. Maybe it was just another unusual piece of the mystery. Who knows? Either way, they took the car and drove, desperate to get away. Their escape led them to Goulburn, New South Wales. As soon as they arrived, they went straight to the authorities, probably because they just stole a car. It is not known exactly what they said. The details of their report were never made public, but according to some resources, they told the police that their parents were missing and that they had last seen them at the Jenolan Caves. Then, things take another strange turn, as they normally do with these videos. At a nearby gas station, Rihanna started acting strangely again. Again, something was wrong with her. Without any explanation, she told Ella that she needed to leave, alone. No one knows exactly what happened in the moments after Rihanna decided to leave, but for some reason she ran into the wilderness, disappearing into the unknown. Meanwhile, the police, acting on the missing persons report, went to the Tromp family home in Sylvan. Ella was now completely alone. She had no phone, no money, and no idea where Rihanna had gone at this point, and with no other options, she decided to take the stolen car and drive home. The car she and Rihanna had taken, again, it's not theirs, but with no better choice, I suppose, you gotta work with what you got. Ella got behind the wheel and then started the long journey back to Victoria. For 7 hours, she drove alone, retracing the path that they had just fled days earlier. When she finally arrived back at the family farm, the police were still inside searching for clues. Everything was still disordered. The unlocked doors, the abandoned belongings, the strange silence of a home, left in panic. Ella was exhausted, confused, and overwhelmed. She did her best to explain everything to police, and she told them how her parents had become convinced that someone was after them. She described the fear, the paranoia, and how the family fled in a complete panic. But none of this made any sense. Not to her, not to the officers questioning her, not to me covering this story. Meanwhile, Mitchell was still missing. Without money or a phone, he had somehow found his way home by train, traveling across the region with no clear plan. It would take him an entire day, but by the morning of August 31st, he had finally arrived back at the family farm. The police hoped that after some rest, Ella and Mitchell could maybe provide some answers. But that never happened because there are none. Even after thinking back on everything, they couldn't explain why their parents had been so afraid. They didn't understand what had caused the sudden breakdown of their once stable family. But Rihanna was still missing. For 2 whole days, she had completely vanished without a trace. No one knows exactly where she went or what happened during that time. She must have been wandering in the wilderness somewhere near Goulburn, but no one had ever seen her. As a fun fact, where is she? No one knows. Completely disappeared because no one reported her. She was just simply gone. Vanished, some would say. Then on September 1st, something strange happened again. A man named Keith, a local from the area, was driving near Goulburn Airport when he felt something pressing against the back of his seat. At first, he thought it was nothing. That's alarming. But then he turned around and he saw her. Rihanna was lying in the back of his vehicle, motionless, silent, and completely unresponsive. She wasn't speaking, she wasn't moving, she just stared empty-eyed into space. Keith had no idea how she had gotten into his vehicle, he had never seen her before, and he had no clue when or where she had climbed in. Had she been there for minutes, hours, maybe a couple of days? All he knew was that something was very, very wrong. He immediately called the authorities. When the police arrived, Rihanna didn't move. She remained completely catatonic, staring straight ahead, her body weak from dehydration and exhaustion. She couldn't remember who she was, where she was, or how she even got there. She had no memory of the last 2 days, as the officers quickly took her to Goulburn Hospital, where the doctors placed her in the psychiatric ward for urgent treatment. It seemed like Rihanna was incredibly lucky to have even come across someone like Keith. If she had run into the wrong person while she was in such a vulnerable state, things could have ended very differently. Thankfully, she was taken to the hospital where doctors diagnosed her with stress-related illness. She received treatment, and when she was finally ready to be questioned, her responses were much like Ella and Mitchell's. She struggled to explain what actually had happened. She couldn't say why she had been so terrified or why her parents had suddenly been convinced that they were in such danger. All she knew was that a feeling of fear had been growing, a deep, unshakable fear that someone or something was watching them, that she had to escape, and so did everyone else. But where were Mark and Jacoba? With 3 of the 5 family members found, authorities began focusing on the last known location of the parents, the Jenolan Caves. It was the most logical place for the search, as that's where they had been. After all, the sisters had reported seeing them there before they had fled. But when the search teams arrived, they found absolutely nothing. There was no trace of Mark or Jacoba inside of these caves. No sign, actually, that they had ever even been there in the first place. Rescue teams combed through the surrounding wilderness, thick forests, steep cliffs, and deep gorges. The terrain was rugged and dangerous, making the search even harder, but still, there was no sign of them. It was as if they had just completely evaporated, but in reality, Mark and Jacoba weren't in the caves at all. Instead, they had driven 270 miles southwest to a town called Wangaratta. Pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. I'm sure some Australians are gonna be like, "Oi, mate." Oh, that's British. Yeah, there we go. Anyways, and for some reason, just like their daughters, they separated for reasons that still aren't entirely clear. Basically, Mark and Jacoba went on their own little solo adventure. Jacoba decided to use public transportation to travel back north towards the caves. It is unknown whether she intended to return to the Jenolan Caves or if she just simply lost, but she eventually ended up in the town of Yas, YASS. Oh my God. Somebody check on the Australians. While there, she tried to check into a motel, but without a phone, money, or any identification, she was turned away. Then, locals spotted her wandering around the streets because what else are you going to do when you have no ability to pay for anything? She looked confused, disoriented, and deeply distressed. It's unclear exactly what happened next, but at some point, Jacoba was then taken to Goulburn Hospital. There, doctors diagnosed her with exhaustion and extreme psychological distress. Just like Rihanna, Ella, and Mitchell, Jacoba struggled to explain what had actually happened. Her memory was fractured. She couldn't fully recall how things had spiraled out of control. She couldn't say why her family had even fled in the first place. The only thing she remembered was feeling lost in the wilderness and then at some point losing Mark. Meanwhile, back in Wangaratta, Mark was still missing. At approximately 10 p.m. on August 31st, police received a strange report from a couple driving through the town. They said a man in a silver SUV had been following them closely for miles, like too close. At first, they assumed it was just an impatient driver, but as the tailgating continued, they grew uneasy. No matter what they did, the SUV stayed right behind them. Finally, feeling unsafe, they pulled over, hoping the car would just pass, but instead of driving away, the SUV also pulled over. At that point, stay in your car and run them over. I mean, look, man, I know it's Australia, so you don't exactly have the Second Amendment out there, but you do have a vehicle that is several thousand pounds that can also be used in that capacity. Anyway, so the driver, a man who looked angry and on edge, stepped out and just stood there, staring at them. Then suddenly, without saying a word, he turned and ran straight into Merriwa Park. The couple, shaken by the encounter, immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, they quickly checked the SUV. It was Ella's missing Peugeot. Honestly, I'd never seen that car name before in my life. The keys were still in the ignition, but Mark was nowhere to be found. They searched the park and there was no trace of him either. Even when they brought in search dogs, they couldn't pick up a scent. Mark Tromp had also vanished. On September 3rd at around 5:50 p.m., nearly a week after the Tromp family had mysteriously fled their home, Mark was finally found. A passerby walking near Wangaratta Airport spotted him wandering around the roadside. He appeared confused and distressed, as if he was in a daze. The police were called and they took Mark to the local police station. He was questioned for about 5 hours and underwent a mental health assessment. Afterwards, he was released into the care of his brother, who was also a police officer. By the time the case had captured the national attention, the Australian public was kind of fascinated by this because it was a bit strange, and the media was eager for answers. Reporters wanted to know why a seemingly normal family had suddenly disappeared, only to be scattered in different directions. The day after Mark's release, Mitchell and Ella gave an interview. They thanked the police and the public for their help and in locating their family. However, they had little to offer in terms of an actual explanation as to what went down. Even after several days of reflection, they were still as confused as everyone else. They struggled to recall the exact sequence of events or why their parents had been so terrified. The fear had felt real at the time, but now, looking back, it made no sense. The lead officer on the case later admitted that in his last 30 years of service, this was the strangest incident he had ever investigated. Authorities searched for logical explanations, starting with the family's finances. If they had been struggling with debt or maybe in financial ruin, that could have caused the extreme stress. However, investigators found no signs of financial trouble. Their businesses were stable. They had no large outstanding debts, and there was no evidence of loans from suspicious sources. The police would also look into the possibility that the Tromps had been threatened. If someone had been stalking them or making them feel unsafe, it might explain their paranoia. However, after examining phone records and interviewing close friends and associates, authorities found no signs of external threats. One of the most obvious questions was that the family had been under the influence of drugs or other substances that could cause paranoia or delusions, but medical tests showed no traces of drug use. Despite an in-depth investigation, no clear answers were ever found. Investigators explored several possibilities to explain the Tromp family's strange behavior. One of the big ones being exposure to toxicity. One of the first theories that they had, kind of raised to say, what the hell is this? Was that they had accidentally been exposed to something toxic while living together on the farm. If a chemical leak or some other form of environmental exposure had occurred, it could explain the entire family being affected at the same time. And this theory was taken seriously, and investigators visited the Tromp home to kind of check for signs of contamination. They tested for carbon monoxide, a gas that can cause confusion, paranoia, and hallucinations if inhaled in high amounts. However, after a thorough inspection, no harmful substances were found in or around the house. With no evidence of a poisoning, investigators then turned to maybe a psychological explanation. The first one, in the most widely accepted theory, is a rare condition known as the shared psychotic disorder, also known as the folie à deux, which not related to any dancing clowns or anything like that, but it's essentially a shared madness. This disorder occurs when one person with a strong delusion influences others close to them, making them believe in the same irrational fears. While it is most commonly going to affect two people, in very rare cases, it has spread to larger groups, just like it seemed to in the Tromp family. This condition was once classified as a separate mental disorder, but since 2013, it has been included under schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders in the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual used by mental health professionals today. A hypothetical example of how this might work would be two brothers living in isolation. If one of them develops a belief that they are being stalked by a secretive organization, the other, through constant exposure, might begin to believe the same thing, even if there really is no evidence. The fear becomes so real to them that their actions start to reflect that paranoia. Many have compared the Tromp family's case to another mysterious incident, the Yuba County Five, also known as the American Dietolab Pass. In that case, a group of 5 men also appeared to suffer a shared psychological episode, but with much deadlier consequences. While the shared psychotic disorder theory kind of makes the most amount of sense, there is no definitive proof that this is what happened to the Tromp family, since none of them had a history of mental illness and all seemed to return to normal just after a few days. Their sudden mass delusion remains one of Australia's most unsettling mysteries. This shared madness could have actually also caused the Tromp family to take extreme and irrational actions, like fleeing into the wilderness to escape an imaginary threat. A similar pattern, again, was seen in Yuba County 5 disappearance, where the group of men vanished under equally mysterious circumstances. Psychologists don't really fully understand how these episodes begin, but in the Tromp family's case, it's likely that Mark was the inducer, the person whose paranoia spread to others. Mark may have truly believed that someone was after them, and because Jacoba was so close to him, both physically and emotionally, she was the first to adopt his fears. The way these delusions spread often depends on how much trust the second person has in the inducer. If someone deeply respects and believes in the person having these paranoid thoughts, well, they're more likely to accept those fears as reality. Mark was convinced that his family was in danger, and his fear would have felt completely real to Jacoba. She saw his genuine distress, and in turn, she became terrified. Once both parents believed that they were being hunted, it became even easier for their children, Mitchell, Ella, and Rihanna, to kind of get caught up in that panic. At that point, there were 2 trusted figures reinforcing this delusion, making it even more convincing. Mitchell was lucky to kind of snap out of it earlier, but Rihanna in particular seemed to be affected the most. Ella also managed to break away from the paranoia, but not before they had all fled their home and gone their separate ways. A lead investigator in the Yuba County 5 case once expressed disbelief at their strange disappearance, saying it was impossible to explain without considering foul play or a real threat. The Tromp case left investigators also just as confused. The lead officer admitted that in his 30-year career, he had never seen anything so unusual. But because the family truly believed that they were being chased by an unknown force, police investigated, every possible explanation, but this is really all they could come up with. They searched for financial troubles, threats from outsiders, or any reason to justify their fears, but they found nothing. In the end, it appeared that the threat really had never ever been real. It had started with Mark, spread to Jacoba, and then consumed the rest of the family. And eventually, the police investigation ended, and their final conclusion was that this was just a case of a shared psychotic disorder. Ella and Rihanna were briefly charged for stealing a vehicle near Gentleman Caves, but the charges were later dropped due to the unusual circumstances. Still, it took until March 2017 for Ella to fully recover from the trauma. The psychological toll on the entire family must have been enormous. Later, the Tromps had come to terms with the fact that their fears had been unfounded and their actions had put them in real danger. However, none of this was truly their fault. When this type of psychological disorder takes hold, it is nearly impossible to recognize what is real and what is not. Though they have stayed out of the public eye, one can only hope that they have actually found peace after all of this. So, one kind of something I would like to highlight real quick before we kind of wrap this thing up. This is usually just when I'm talking to you guys directly rather than, reading my scripts and whatnot, is it might seem like, okay, well, that's ridiculous. You just share a psychotic incident. Now, a lot of people tend to kind of discount anything that's said because they haven't like witnessed it themselves, and I get it. It's an easy thing to do. But consider this: the dancing plague that existed, I believe it was in like the 14 or 1500s. There was 78 people who just started dancing, and they would not stop. Like, they had to get the church out there to try to stop people because they assumed it to be just like a demonic infestation, essentially. And what happened is some people literally danced to their death. They just didn't stop, and they couldn't get them to stop. It was absolutely crazy. So the problem is, humans are social animals, and because we are social animals, whether we like it or not, we take cues from one another. And this is why things like propaganda are so effective, because they hijack a portion of your brain that you really, for you to undo your social side, essentially, you're undoing your humanity, which is not possible because you're human. Now, there's going to be somebody invariably in the comments like, oh, I'm fine by myself. I don't need people, blah, 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 and all that nonsense. But the reality of the situation is you do. You need to socialize, and whether you think it or not, you do socialize with people. Otherwise, you actually have a literal mental disorder, and that means your brain isn't working correctly, in which case you're probably actually immune to propaganda. Regardless, you're also probably not listening to me right now. So the point is that shared psychotic disorders do exist. We have seen them in the past, but it's interesting when they crop up out of nowhere and for seemingly no reason. Now, the problem with checking for toxicity, let's say like a gas was released from the ground because they work with the earth. If they had like a pocket of gas or something and they were all around it and they just didn't know that they hit a pocket of gas, it is possible that this could start tripping their brain to kind of start firing or misfiring in a way that would make somebody more paranoid. Because remember, if your amygdala misfires for literally no reason, you start having panic and you're afraid of everything. And this can actually spread to others. So if you have possibly, let's say you open up a hole in the ground, right? And you have 5 family members near it. You got, let's say Mitchell's in the excavator, and I don't know, Mark and Jacoba are near the hole and the sisters are a few feet back. Let's say the parents get blasted with this gas first and the strongest concentration of it, their brains start operating a little differently, but everybody is affected. The point is that this can cause your brain to start functioning differently while that gas is still in your body, and it can have impacts that are still, further reaching. For instance, a lot of people tend to think that marijuana, for instance, is, totally safe and there's no problems with it and blah, 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 and all that stuff. Well, I'm not going to knock anybody for their own personal choices because you're probably an adult listening to this. That's your choice to do whatever you want. I drink beer, so I'm not going to look down on anybody. But the point is that can actually trigger psychosis. A lot of people don't know that, and it can actually trigger schizophrenia in those who wouldn't have otherwise basically had their schizophrenia present. So, what was it? My ex-wife was talking to me one time about how there was this 18-year-old actually who smoked marijuana, and then it triggered their psychosis. And they were going to go to this college, they were going to do XYZ, and they had to drop all of that because they were in a constant state of psychosis for months. I don't know if the person ever pulled out of it. You can typically help with medication, but the point is, once you reach psychosis, once that's induced, this would help to explain why they can't really remember what they did, because it is a misfiring of the brain. Everything is not like, I don't know if you've ever had it happen, but when your brain misfires or you're under an extreme amount of stress, so things aren't really operating the way that they normally do, you're not really making memories. You're not really behaving properly. It's like sometimes you're not even listening correctly. Everything around you becomes kind of disconnected, and there's a ton of mental disorders associated with that, but it could have been possibly a gas exposure that enough time had passed that it's like, okay, well, we don't detect anything, but it did affect the family. They entered a state of possibly, not prolonged psychosis, but psychosis that lasted long enough that they couldn't actually recover, I guess is the best way to talk about it. But then a week later, they were able to be like, oh my God, what have I done? Where have I been? Who am I? Because their brains finally start firing in a normal pattern because either the gas in their system was removed or just enough time had passed where the body was able to reestablish homeostasis and then begin firing again normally. And the reality is that the brain's functionality when firing and communicating is very delicate, and if something knocks that off course, it can have some longer reaching consequences that in this case it seems like it lasted about a week, but that's not a complete unknown for the human body to experience. So essentially, my take on it is I think that there is some sort of gas they could have possibly been exposed to that caused them to enter a state of psychosis. And then, depending on how scared one person is in psychosis, that can have impacts on others. And also, you know, something to note is the age. The mother and father were older, obviously, so their, I guess, exposure and like their body's ability to reach homeostasis again is going to take longer than it would for their kids to do who were in their 20s. So that's also something to consider. But anyhow, I want to hear what you guys think. Do you think my random incoherent rambling about possibly a gas exposure and then a prolonged state of psychosis is correct, or do you think that it's aliens or Bigfoot threatening them? Let me know down in the comments. I want to thank you guys for watching. Absolutely cool of you. If you did enjoy the content, please leave a like because it helps get the video out there. And subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I want to thank my patrons real quick. At the literal Wendigo tier, we have Grayson West, Michigan Dogman, Monkey Man, Scrungle, and Stupid Fox. Thank you guys for your awesome support. At the Eyewitness to the Event tier, we have Beaver Malaga and Dragon Master Knight. Thank you guys. At the first-hand accounts tier, we have Yeeps. And then at the second-hand accounts tier, we have Bianca, Fred Rush, Stutz, and Troy. And the rest of my patrons, I do appreciate y'all's support as well because a long way towards helping out. So thank you. But all right, guys, that's going to do it for me. I hope everybody enjoyed, and I will see y'all in the next one.